The cathedral doors flew open, and there she was, my stepsister, in a blazing red dress, screaming for my wedding to stop. She said the man waiting for me at the altar belonged to her. Everyone turned to me, expecting tears. But I just smiled, because I had been waiting for this moment. If you've ever dreamed of seeing justice served in the most unforgettable way, this story is for you. Subscribe now, like this video, and join our community where betrayal meets poetic payback, and where the truth always finds its way to the light. Let's begin. The cathedral doors slammed against the stone walls with a force that made the organ music stop mid-note. Gasps rippled through the crowd as every head turned toward the entrance. There she was, Madison Clark, my stepsister, framed in the doorway like some tragic heroine from an old romance novel. She was dressed in a scarlet gown so bright it could have set the stained glass on fire. In her hands, she clutched nothing but her pride, and in her eyes, there was a glint of pure triumph. "Stop the wedding," she shouted, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "He belongs to me." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, sinking into the stunned expressions of our guests, Boston's elite, old money, and new power, all gathered to witness the perfect union between Evelyn Carter and Alexander Hale. Only now, perfection had been shattered in the most public way possible. Alexander, standing at the altar in his tailored charcoal suit, turned to face her. His eyes widened for a split second, not in love, but in shock. Then he looked at me. I could see it in his expression. He was waiting for me to crumble, to cry, to run. He expected me to be the fragile little girl Madison had always painted me to be. But I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Instead, I felt the corner of my mouth curl into a smile. The kind of smile that comes when you've been waiting for this exact moment for months, maybe years. My heels clicked against the marble as I stepped forward, my bouquet steady in my hand. "Madison," I said, my voice calm but carrying through the cathedral, "I'm so glad you could make it. I've been waiting for this moment." A ripple of murmurs swept through the pews. Madison's smirk faltered for the briefest second. Then I reached into the silk clutch I had hidden under my bouquet and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. Heavy, cream-colored paper. My handwriting on the front. "This," I said, holding it up so everyone could see, "is a letter. But not from me. It's from Madison, to herself." Confusion flickered across the guests' faces. I opened the envelope, slid out several folded pages, and began to read. "Alex deserves someone who understands his world. Evelyn is just a charity case who got lucky. I've seen the way he looks at me during family dinners. He knows he chose wrong." Gasps erupted. Someone in the second row actually dropped their program. Madison's confident posture wavered, her fingers twitching at her sides. I kept reading, my voice steady, every word striking like a hammer on glass. "She doesn't know how to handle his wealth. I could run the Winchester estate better than she ever could. When I save him from this mistake, he'll finally see I'm the one." By now, Madison's face was pale beneath her flawless makeup. The bravado in her eyes had turned to something darker, panic. Because she knew what I was reading was real. Her handwriting. Her private diary. The one she never thought I'd find. I paused, letting the silence work for me. I could hear the heavy breaths of the guests, feel the tension pressing in from all sides. And then I read the final line of the page. "Tomorrow, everything changes. The red dress is perfect. My speech is perfect. By this time tomorrow, Alex will finally be mine." The room erupted again, this time in a wave of horrified whispers. Madison took a single step back, mascara starting to smear at the edges of her eyes. For a woman who had built her entire life on appearances, it was the first crack in the mask, and I wanted every single person here to see it. "Evelyn," my mother began, her voice shaking from the front row. I raised a hand without looking at her. No, Mom. She made her choice. Alexander took my free hand and squeezed it. There was no hesitation in his eyes now. No uncertainty. We turned back to the officiant. Shall we continue? I asked. The ceremony went on, more powerful for having survived its attempted destruction. Madison fled the cathedral before the vows were even finished, her heels echoing down the marble steps outside. She didn't look back. What no one in that room knew, what Madison certainly didn't know, was that this wasn't just luck or quick thinking. I had been preparing for this confrontation from the moment she found out about my engagement. I knew her patterns, her obsessions, the way she would twist any joy of mine into something she could try to claim for herself. And this time, I had decided to let her walk straight into her own trap. As the applause swelled and Alexander kissed me for the first time as his wife, I looked at the empty spot where Madison had been standing. This wasn't the end of her schemes. I knew her too well for that. It was just the opening move. People like to say rivalry starts with a single event, a sharp moment you can point to and say, this is where it began. With Madison, it was never one moment. It was 100 small cuts, a sweater borrowed and accidentally ruined, a rumor slipped like a note into the back row of a classroom, an apology that sounded like perfume, pretty, sweet, and impossible to breathe around. When our parents married, I was 13 and careful. Madison was 14 and curated. She arrived at our home with luggage that matched and a vocabulary built on social gloss. I arrived with scholarship brochures and a worn-out backpack. In those early months, I learned the first rule of surviving Madison Clark: never announce what matters to you. She collected other people's joys like trophies, and once she knew you wanted something, she made it her sport to take it. If I was proud of a grade, she'd spread a story about the teacher favoring me. If I made a new friend, she became their confessor. And when I began to date, carefully, quietly, she became the girl they noticed in doorways, with the luminous skin and the easy laugh, the perfect balance of fragile and exciting. It just happened, she'd say, head tilted, hands open, innocence rehearsed to the last eyelash flick. I learned to swallow anger before I tasted it. My mother, Diana, believed in smoothing edges. Her new husband, Robert Clark, believed in buying solutions. The house changed around me, hallways lacquered in quiet money, the dining table lengthening, the schedule filled with charity luncheons where praise was currency and eye contact was a negotiation. Madison loved it. She danced through it like a girl who'd been cast in the role of a lifetime. I studied. I stacked small victories where she couldn't see them. Every night, under the glow of a cheap desk lamp, I took apart equations and assembled a future. Harvard didn't arrive because I was special, it arrived because I refused to let envy set my syllabus. When the acceptance letter came, Madison smiled the way a cat studies a birdcage. Yale is just as good, she told anyone who would listen. And, honestly, Harvard can be so provincial. She said it like a kindness. Robert nodded along, already planning a celebratory dinner. I went upstairs and ran my fingers across the ridge of my suitcase, counting the days until I could learn in a place where people listened more than they posed. College gave me air, it didn't give me a reprieve. I dated exactly 3 men in those years, each one stolen at the precise moment affection turned into future tense. Madison didn't need to be there in person. A text at midnight, a drop-by visit during a family weekend, a story about running into him at a gallery. She knew how to leave fingerprints without ever touching the glass. The lesson was brutal but clarifying: I wouldn't win by hiding. I would win by understanding the game better than she did, and by refusing to play it the way she wanted. Years later, when I met Alexander Hale beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Metropolis Museum's charity gala, there was nothing strategized about it. He was giving a keynote on educational equity, speaking with the kind of measured conviction that makes you check your own pulse. I was there representing my company, a startup building adaptive learning tools for public schools. He asked the kinds of questions people ask when they actually want the answers. We talked about attention gaps and teacher burnout and how software can nudge without replacing human warmth. Madison had RSVP'd to the same event but cancelled with a carefully phrased illness. The universe had offered me one evening without her choreography. If we'd kept it to a good conversation, perhaps there would have been no story. But Alexander asked me to coffee. Coffee became 3 coffees, then dinners, then a habit of walking home through Beacon Hill, sharing the kinds of childhood details that map the fault lines beneath an adult life. He told me about the pressure of old families and older expectations. I told him about how silence and survival can look like the same virtue when you're a teenager. The night he proposed, he did it simply, on my living room floor, between stacks of draft proposals and 2 cups of tea. I said yes because it felt like choosing a future, not an audience. Madison found out before we announced it. That was my first mistake. She hadn't lost her informants in our house, she'd just trained them to think of gossip as a love language. She arrived at my door with lilies, a smile stretched tight as ribbon, and a promise, "Let me be your maid of honor." It sounded generous. It was reconnaissance. I said yes, because I had learned the deeper lesson: never block her from the stage. Let her step into the light she craved. It makes the truth so much easier to see. The diary came by accident, or so I thought. 3 months after the engagement, I stopped by my mother's to help clean the guest rooms. Behind the vanity in Madison's old suite, a small leather journal had slipped between wood and wall. Black cover. No lock. The first page was a neat script I recognized immediately. It wasn't a schedule. It wasn't gratitude. It was a confession without conscience. Alex deserves someone who understands his world. Evelyn is a charity case who got lucky. He knows he chose wrong. I read in bursts, blood humming in my ears. She documented our dinners in ink, critiqued my dress choices like a publicist, and narrated my supposed social missteps with the relish of a courtroom prosecutor. She had picked a shade of red for a dress months before the save-the-dates were printed. She was rehearsing a speech. She was, in her own words, saving him. The arrogance would have been laughable if it hadn't been so meticulously plotted. I didn't confront her. I called Olivia. Olivia has been my ballast since sophomore year, the friend who knows when to pour tea and when to pour gasoline. She arrived at my apartment, read the diary with her eyebrows climbing higher and higher, and set it down like it might bite. "We can end this today," she said. Airdrop screenshots to everyone. She thrives in whispers, kill the whisper. Not yet, I told her. Let her keep writing. Every page is a receipt she can't return. From that day, I catalogued. I didn't snoop so much as I learned her habits. Madison wrote when she was euphoric and when she was threatened. She left expensive things in obvious places and private things where she felt untouchable, under couch cushions at our mother's, in the side pocket of a tote she took to fittings, inside the lining of a garment bag. A pattern emerged. She hid her secrets where she believed the help wouldn't look and family wouldn't dare. She had never met a cleaning schedule she respected or a boundary she didn't treat as imaginary. I told Alexander everything. He listened, at first stunned and then very quiet, with the posture of a man measuring the difference between courtesy and complicity. He'd known Madison as charming, a little theatrical, lightly competitive, the harmless garnish to a society table. Seeing her handwriting broke the spell. We made a pact that night in the soft, grainy light of our kitchen, no more pretending not to notice. We would build our wedding day like we built our work, intentionally, with redundancies, with truth. And we would give Madison exactly what she wanted in one respect, an audience. Planning became a chessboard. Madison insisted on the flower palette, then criticized it. She volunteered to coordinate tastings, then, accidentally, changed the reservation time. She lingered at moments that belonged to me, placing herself in photos with the gravity of a planet trying to capture a moon. Every time, I stepped back, not in surrender, but in study. I didn't need to stop her, I needed her to believe she was unstoppable. Meanwhile, I took care of the quiet details that matter. I spoke with the officiant about disruptions, with venue staff about entrances and acoustics, with security about the difference between spectacle and safety. The organist, a gentleman with a spine of iron, agreed to follow my cue and no one else's. A week before the ceremony, I found the second diary. This one wasn't hidden, it was displayed on Madison's vanity like a prop. She wanted me to see it, pages flagged with silk ribbons, entries written with a fountain pen in a script so ornate it looked like performance. It read like a screenplay, third row left for optimal projection. Pause after belongs to me to let shock settle. Red reads as destiny against white marble. Everyone will remember. I closed the book and stared at my reflection, the old desk lamp girl staring back from beneath perfect makeup. I thought of all the times I had swallowed humiliation because calling it out would have made me look fragile. I thought of the life I was building that didn't require approval to function. Then I slid the diary into a document sleeve and labeled it like evidence. The last days moved like a calm river over hidden currents. Madison smiled brightly and practiced softness. Our mother fussed over seating and pretended not to notice the theater. Robert signed checks like signatures could fix character. Olivia moved silently through my apartment, creating lists, texting confirmations, building a scaffolding beneath my composure. When I couldn't sleep, I imagined strings crossing the city, tugging narratives into place, the organist's eyes on my nod, the usher knowing which aisle to block if a red dress appeared, the letter in my clutch with just enough truth to shatter a myth. On the morning of the wedding, the light over Boston was clean and cold. I ate toast. I answered Olivia's, "You ready?" with a photograph of my shoes on the floor and a single line, "I'm past ready." At the cathedral, the air smelled faintly of lilies and old stone. Guests murmured like a tide. Alexander stood at the altar with the steady posture of a man who knows the difference between crisis and theater. I felt a strange, peaceful distance from my body, as if I were both the woman in white and the girl at the desk lamp, watching to learn. You know what happened when the doors flew open. You know what she wore. You know what I read. What you don't know, what no one knew as the vows continued and Madison's footsteps faded down the steps, was that the wedding was only the proof of concept. Public exposure was never the destination. It was the hinge. Because people like Madison don't stop when you shine a light on them, they stop when they finally run out of script. And I had just taken away her favorite lines. After the reception, Alexander and I danced beneath strings of lights that made the room feel like a new sky. He rested his forehead against mine and whispered, "You didn't just survive her." "No," I said, the letter finally quiet in my clutch. "I learned her." Later, when our guests had gone and the band had packed up, I laid the diaries on our dining table and opened a clean notebook. Not to write about Madison, but to chart what came next. Because if the red dress was Act 1's finale, Act 2 would be colder, quieter, and far more deliberate. It would be the part where I stopped letting her chase my life and led her, step by step, into the empty room she'd built for herself. I titled that fresh page with a line Olivia loved, "Let her talk. Let her write. Let her walk into her own echo." Then I turned off the light and went to bed beside my husband, the city humming beyond the windows, the future waiting, unafraid, to be written. The first rule of dismantling someone like Madison is simple: don't chase. Let them think they're leading. Let them believe they're writing the story. The trick is making sure you've already drafted the ending. Alexander and I returned from our honeymoon to find Boston just as we'd left it, polite, polished, and quietly vicious beneath the surface. Madison had vanished from the social scene, claiming to take time abroad for self-care, which in her language meant licking her wounds in a setting glamorous enough to photograph. My mother forwarded me a postcard from Milan, a picture of the Duomo, a note that read, *, you looked beautiful at the wedding. Call me when you've come to your senses, *. I didn't call. I had other work to do. Step 1 was planting seeds. Small, plausible suggestions fed through channels I knew Madison still monitored: family dinners, mutual friends, the kind of gatherings where gossip passes like champagne. I told my mother that Alexander and I were navigating some growing pains in our marriage. I let Olivia mention at a charity brunch that we were considering separate vacations. Victoria Hale, Alexander's mother, agreed to casually lament to a mutual acquaintance that Evelyn seems distracted lately. Step 2 was performance. Public argument staged in just the right venues, a disagreement at a gallery opening about a painting's placement, a clipped exchange over dinner at the Beacon Club. Always brief, never loud, but just enough for someone to notice and repeat. The separate vacations were real on paper, but mine was a business trip to San Francisco for an educational conference, his a week in D.C. meeting with policy advisors for our foundation. Madison wouldn't know that. She'd just see the photos, me at a hotel rooftop bar, him at a Washington dinner, each of us surrounded by people she didn't recognize. Step 3 was patience. Madison had always been reactive, unable to resist acting when she sensed vulnerability. I needed her to think our marriage was faltering, not collapsing, but leaning just enough that she could rescue Alexander. That was her pattern. She didn't steal for the sake of possession, she stole for the satisfaction of taking something at its most desirable moment. The bait worked faster than I expected. 2 months into our subtle campaign, Charlotte, Madison's former roommate and my quiet ally, forwarded me screenshots of messages Madison had sent from Paris. *, it's happening. She's unraveling. He'll see I was right all along. *, attached was a photograph of a crimson silk gown laid across her bed, a shade I recognized instantly. She was already rehearsing. Alexander read the messages in silence, his jaw tightening. She's really going to try again. She has no idea what she's walking into, I said, sliding the phone back to Charlotte's thread. We'll make sure of it. While Madison wrote her fantasy ending in Paris, I collected my own evidence. Charlotte still had keys to Madison's old Boston apartment, where a storage unit in the basement held more than forgotten furniture. Inside, stacked in neat boxes, were diaries going back to our teenage years, drafts of her earliest imitations. Lists of my favorite books with annotations on how to speak about them convincingly. Pages where she'd practiced my handwriting. Notes on my wardrobe choices with suggestions for improvements if she were wearing them. Reading them was like watching a black and white film develop into color, the obsession deepening, the methods refining, until Alexander became the centerpiece. I kept the most revealing volumes aside. They would be my insurance policy, my endgame. But for now, they stayed locked in my office safe, labeled not as Madison, but as research. The return was inevitable. Madison came back to Boston in early spring, her hair darker, her accent slightly affected, the way people talk when they want you to know they've been living elsewhere. She appeared at the Hale Foundation's annual spring luncheon uninvited, wearing a soft blue dress, innocent, approachable, as if the red dress had been a phase. She worked the room carefully, her charm muted, her laugh lower. I almost admired the restraint. Almost. Our paths crossed at the dessert table, over a platter of petit fours. You look, well, she said, eyes scanning me in that way she had, cataloging everything. Thank you, I replied. Marriage agrees with me. Her smile was quick, brittle. I've been hearing things. I hope you and Alexander are managing. Oh, you know, I said, leaning in just enough for her to catch the scent of my perfume, the same one I'd worn at the wedding. Every marriage has its seasons. Some more interesting than others. She tilted her head, curious. The hook had been set. Over the next weeks, sightings of Madison increased. A corner seat at the cafe Alexander favored after board meetings. A quiet presence in the third row at one of my public lectures. Always just far enough to be coincidental, always close enough for word to reach me. She began circulating again in our social sphere, speaking of her newfound clarity and healing abroad. People who didn't know her well believed it. People who did, like Olivia, like Victoria, saw the gleam in her eyes when Alexander entered a room. Victoria, who had once been her harshest critic, now played her part beautifully. "She's different," she told Madison over lunch one afternoon, knowing the comment would filter back to me. "More grounded. If only Evelyn could let her in." I didn't need to ask what Madison made of that. She was a moth, and we had just lit a lamp. The stage was set for the Winchester Foundation Gala, the kind of event Madison considered her natural habitat. She had once written, in one of the diaries now in my possession, that the gala is where alliances are cemented and weaknesses exposed. She wasn't wrong. She just never expected to be the one on display. A week before the gala, Charlotte confirmed the rumors. Madison had purchased a gown in deep emerald silk, the color of redemption, as she told the boutique clerk. She was planning to approach Alexander on the terrace, away from the crowd, to clear the air. It was a scene she'd scripted years ago in another context. She was simply reusing the material. I let her think she was the only one with a plan. In reality, every variable was accounted for: where she would stand, who would be within earshot, the lighting that would catch her expression when I stepped into view. And in my hands, not champagne or a polite smile, but a stack of her childhood diaries, ready to be read. The trap was ready. Madison just didn't know she'd already walked into it. The night of the Winchester Foundation Gala shimmered with the kind of opulence that makes people forget to blink. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the grand ballroom, the air was heavy with the scent of gardenias, and every corner hummed with the soft clink of champagne flutes. Alexander and I arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, hand in hand, both of us dressed for war under the guise of celebration. My gown was black silk, sharp, clean lines, the kind of dress that says nothing and reveals everything if you know how to look. Madison was already there. I spotted her across the room before she saw me. Emerald silk clung to her like she'd been poured into it, the deep green catching the light with every calculated turn of her body. She laughed softly at something a man said, her hand resting on his sleeve, but her eyes drifted constantly toward Alexander. Watching. Waiting. Victoria Hale played her part seamlessly, weaving between conversations, feeding Madison morsels of reassurance. "He seems distant tonight," I overheard her tell Madison in a voice pitched low enough to feel private, but not so low it couldn't carry. "I'm sure he'd appreciate someone he can really talk to." Madison's expression softened into something dangerous: hope. I slipped away from the main hall and into the terrace corridor, the cool marble under my heels echoing in the quiet. Outside, the city stretched below like a jeweled tapestry. I positioned myself in the shadowed corner near the French doors, the stack of diaries tucked neatly under my arm. Their covers were worn from years of handling, teenage handwriting fading into adult cursive, a living archive of her obsession. Right on cue, Madison appeared in the doorway, scanning the terrace until her eyes landed on Alexander. He stood near the balustrade, glass in hand, gazing out over the skyline like a man lost in thought. He was performing just as we'd rehearsed, approachable but preoccupied, ready to listen. Madison stepped toward him, her heels whispering across the stone. "Alexander," she began, her voice warm, almost trembling. "I know this might not be the place, but I've been carrying something for a long time. I think we both have." Alexander turned, polite, his expression carefully neutral. "Madison." "I've had time to reflect," she said, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent confession. "About the wedding, about everything. I see now that I was reacting to." "That's enough," I said, stepping into the light. The shift in her face was immediate: surprise, then irritation, then a flicker of panic as she noticed what I was holding. Her eyes dropped to the diaries. "Where did you?" "You left them behind," I said, my voice carrying easily across the terrace. "Well, not all of them. Some you hid. Some you displayed like trophies." "I've read every one." A murmur rose from the guests just inside the French doors, those close enough to see us beginning to drift closer, drawn like moths to heat. Madison glanced at the growing audience, then back at me. "This is inappropriate," she hissed. "No," I said softly, "this is overdue." I opened the first diary to a page marked with a ribbon and began to read. "Evelyn's handwriting is neat but unremarkable. I can improve it with practice. Today I traced her signature for an hour. She signs the Y with a flourish, mine will be cleaner." A few gasps fluttered through the air. I turned another page. "Memorized her favorite books today. Must be ready to discuss them if Alex brings them up. Still working on perfecting her laugh, it's lighter at the start, deeper at the end." By now, the terrace had filled with a semicircle of silent onlookers. Madison's emerald gown glowed under the terrace lights, but her face had gone pale. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking. I ignored her, flipping to another diary, older, smaller, the ink faded but legible. Madison, age 15, she got into Harvard. Daddy says Yale is just as good, but everyone knows it's not. She'll think she's better than me. She's wrong. I closed the diary and looked straight at her. This didn't start with Alexander. He was just the latest thing you thought you could take. The crowd shifted, the unspoken truth rippling through them. This wasn't a spat between sisters. This was years of imitation, calculation, and theft laid bare in her own words. Madison tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "You're twisting this. They're just private thoughts." "They're a blueprint," I said. "And tonight, I'm showing everyone that the life you've been trying to steal doesn't belong to you. It never did." For a moment, she stood perfectly still, the green silk catching the wind from the city beyond. Then her shoulders sagged, the practiced mask falling away. "How did you always know?" she whispered. "Because you wrote it all down," I replied, holding up the diaries. "Every plan. Every scheme. The only thing you never wrote was your own story." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the knowledge that her unmasking had been complete. Madison turned away, her movement slow, as if the weight of her own words had finally settled on her shoulders. Without another glance at Alexander, she walked back into the ballroom and kept walking until she was gone. I slipped the diaries into my bag and turned to face the crowd. No one said a word. They didn't need to. The truth had been louder than anything I could have planned. Alexander stepped to my side, his hand warm against mine. "That was final," he murmured. "No," I said, watching the spot where Madison had disappeared. "That was just the last act she'll ever perform in my life." The city lights flickered against the terrace walls, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not victory, not relief, but an uncluttered quiet. For the first time, I knew Madison's story in my life was no longer being written by her. Madison didn't vanish so much as she evaporated, quietly, without explanation, leaving only whispers behind. The day after the gala, her apartment was dark, curtains drawn. By the end of the week, her phone number had been disconnected. Friends reported vague texts about needing space and focusing on personal growth. To anyone who hadn't seen the terrace confrontation, it might have sounded like a graceful exit. To me, it was just a retreat to regroup. I wasn't curious about where she had gone, I was curious about what she had left behind. Charlotte called me one Tuesday morning with her voice low, as if the walls might overhear. "You should come by Madison's place. She's not here. But... Evelyn, you need to see this. The key turned in the lock like a sigh. The air inside was stale, faintly perfumed, the way a room smells when someone has tried to mask something they don't want you to notice. Madison's apartment was immaculate on the surface, clothes arranged by color, shoes lined like soldiers, glass tables free of fingerprints. But Charlotte led me straight to the bedroom closet, to a panel on the back wall I had never seen before. Behind it was a small, hidden compartment. And inside that, box after box of diaries. They weren't like the ones I'd already seen. These weren't the curated, fountain pen performances she had left out for me to find. These were raw. Spiral notebooks with bent corners, travel journals from discount stores, sticky notes shoved between pages. Some dated back to when we were teenagers. Others were written just weeks ago. I sat on the floor and opened the top box. The first page I read was dated nearly a year before my engagement to Alexander. Saw Evelyn at the cafe. She's wearing her hair different, looser. I'll try that tomorrow. Harmless enough, until I realized the entries escalated. She met with a man today. Tall, dark hair, suit. Followed them for 2 blocks. He looked at her the way people look at someone they shouldn't want. Page after page, the details became sharper, more invasive. My schedule noted with times down to the minute. My outfits logged with designer names, as if cataloging inventory. Conversations I barely remembered, with friends, with colleagues, even with strangers at events, reconstructed in unsettling precision. And then, in one notebook, a shift. The handwriting became neater, the sentences shorter, clipped. Confirmed Alexander's usual Thursday lunch spot. Sat 2 tables over. Watched. He didn't see me. He will one day. Charlotte stood by the doorway, watching me turn pages. I didn't know it was this bad, she said quietly. I thought she just wanted attention. It wasn't attention. It was possession. One entry, dated 6 weeks before the wedding, stopped me cold. Hired a driver who works hail events. Offered cash for updates. Need to know where they go when they're alone. The next page. Paid off hostess at Belmore Club to call me if they book private dining. Evelyn doesn't deserve those spaces. The words blurred for a moment. It wasn't just about Alexander. It wasn't even just about me. Madison had built a private surveillance network, one that reached into places I had thought were safe. I closed the notebook and set it on the growing pile beside me. Are you going to tell Alexander? Charlotte asked. Yes, I said. But not yet. Because telling him now would end the game, and Madison had been playing too long for me to give her an easy finish. She needed to know that the walls she had been leaning on for years were hollow, that everything she thought she was controlling had already slipped from her hands. I took the most recent stack of notebooks home and locked them in my office safe with the others. That night, over dinner, I told Alexander the first had found more of the same. I didn't tell him about the surveillance. Not yet. His focus was already on expanding our foundation's outreach program. I needed him calm for what was coming. Over the next month, I studied those diaries like case files. I made timelines. I traced patterns, when she'd act, when she'd retreat, how her confidence swelled after seeing signs of weakness in me. Every entry was a blueprint for her behavior, and I was learning to read it fluently. It was in a diary dated just before the gala that I found the most telling line, if she ever truly loses something important, she'll crack. That's when I'll be there. That's when I'll win, The arrogance of it would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing. Madison didn't understand me at all. I had lost important things before, people, opportunities, entire plans for my life, and each time, I had built something new from the wreckage. But she believed loss would break me because that's what it would do to her. It gave me an idea. If Madison needed to believe I was crumbling in order to make her move, then I would give her the perfect illusion of a life in slow collapse. I would let her think the door to Alexander was swinging open again, only this time, when she stepped through, the ground beneath her would disappear. By the time I closed the last diary that night, the plan was already forming. It would require precision, patience, and a very public stage. The kind Madison wouldn't be able to resist. Every good trap needs a convincing stage, and Madison's weakness had always been her appetite for performance. If she was going to make a move, she needed to believe she was stepping into a scene where she could play the savior and the star. My job was to give her that stage, down to the smallest, most believable detail. The first act was social media. I'd always kept my profiles clean, curated, focused on our foundation's work and my business projects. Now, I started adding small fractures. A photo of me at a gala without Alexander, standing slightly off-center, my smile subdued. A caption that read, "Some nights you just feel alone in a crowded room." A series of work trip photos that hinted at long days and little rest. I knew Madison would see them. Even if she'd unfollowed me for appearances, she still had her watchers. And she wouldn't just look, she'd study. The second act was whispers. Olivia began dropping comments at events, carefully vague but pointed enough to land. "Evelyn's been under so much pressure lately," she'd say over coffee with mutual acquaintances, the kind who treat gossip like currency. Victoria played her part, sighing over lunch with a well-placed friend. "I just hope they can work through their differences." Each sentence was a breadcrumb, each conversation a ripple heading toward Madison's ears. The third act was public tension. Alexander and I rehearsed arguments the way some couples rehearse dance steps. A clipped exchange at the country club tennis courts. A cold silence during a dinner at the Beacon Hotel restaurant. Always just long enough for someone nearby to notice, never so long that anyone would suspect it was staged. Our fights were timed for maximum exposure, where whispers would reach the right people. I didn't have to wait long. Charlotte sent me a screenshot one rainy Thursday afternoon. "Madison, messaging a friend, *, she's slipping. I can feel it. He'll see now what I've always known. This is my chance to show him I'm the one who truly understands him. *. Attached was a photo of her in a fitted navy dress, clearly taken in a boutique fitting room. The caption read, "For the night everything changes." I almost laughed. The arrogance was so familiar it felt like déjà vu. But there was one more layer to set before I could spring the trap: vulnerability. Madison had always mistaken vulnerability for weakness, so I decided to give her a show. I started arriving at events looking slightly rushed, my makeup deliberately imperfect, my hair just a touch out of place. At a charity board meeting, I let my phone buzz with a fake text from Attorney Marcus, the name visible enough for Madison's people to report back. Olivia made sure to lean over and whisper, "Are you going to call him back?" in a tone ripe for misinterpretation. By the time the annual Hale Foundation Winter Gala approached, our most high-profile event of the season, the air was thick with speculation. Was Evelyn's marriage in trouble? Was the perfect couple not so perfect after all? The guest list alone guaranteed that anything seen or heard that night would travel faster than truth. I knew Madison would come. She wouldn't be able to help herself. The night of the gala, the ballroom glittered under hundreds of tiny lights strung from the vaulted ceiling. Snow drifted outside in thick, lazy flakes, turning the city into a winter postcard. Alexander and I made our entrance separately, timed 15 minutes apart, a deliberate crack in our united front. I scanned the crowd as I stepped inside, my black velvet gown clinging to the warmth of the room. And there she was. Madison. She'd chosen gold this time, a long, liquid satin gown that caught every flicker of light. It was a calculated choice, regal, untouchable, radiant. She looked exactly like a woman who believed she was about to reclaim something that had been stolen from her. She didn't approach right away. Madison was never impulsive when she thought victory was near. She lingered, laughing with donors, sipping champagne, her eyes flicking toward Alexander every few minutes. She was measuring her moment, waiting for the scene to be perfect. And I was ready. The diaries were in my bag again, but not the ones I'd shown her before. These were the newly discovered ones from her hidden closet, the ones detailing her surveillance, her bribes, her obsession in terms even her most loyal defenders couldn't excuse. I had marked the most damning passages with small red ribbons. Charlotte, Olivia, and Victoria were in position, each knowing their cue. Alexander stood near the center of the ballroom, speaking with a cluster of board members, his posture open, his expression just distracted enough to suggest he might be vulnerable to interruption. I saw the exact moment Madison decided it was time. She placed her empty glass on a passing tray, smoothed her hair, and began moving toward him. Her steps were unhurried, her face a perfect blend of concern and warmth. This was her performance. She believed the audience was hers. But the audience was already mine. I moved before she reached him, intercepting her path with a smile so calm it made her blink. "Madison," I said. "I've been meaning to talk to you. There's something I'd like to read." Her eyes dropped to the bag on my arm, and for the first time that evening, I saw her mask slip, just for a heartbeat. "Not here," she said quickly. "Oh," I replied, stepping closer, lowering my voice just enough for the guests nearby to lean in. "I think here is perfect." The music swelled in the background, the crowd subtly shifting to give us space. The stage was set. And Madison had just walked right into it. The moment I said, "Here is perfect," I felt the air in the ballroom shift. Conversations dulled, as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Madison glanced around, her eyes darting to the clusters of Boston's finest who were now watching us over the rims of their champagne flutes. She tried to smile, but her lips were tight, her knuckles widening around the strap of her gold evening clutch. I opened my bag and pulled out the stack of diaries, the worn leather covers instantly recognizable to anyone who had heard the stories after our wedding. These weren't the carefully manicured journals she had once flaunted. No, these were raw, unfiltered, and ugly in their truth. The red ribbons I'd placed inside peeked out like warning flags. "Do you remember writing these?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying. My tone was gentle, almost conversational, but in the quiet of the ballroom, it might as well have been amplified. Madison shook her head slightly, a flicker of defiance crossing her face. "Those are private," she said, her voice low and trembling. "They were," I replied. "Until you made my life your favorite subject." I opened the first diary to a marked page. 3 weeks before my wedding, I read, "Hired driver who works hail events. Paid him cash for updates on Alexander's movements. Need to know where they go when they're alone." I let the words hang for a moment. A ripple moved through the crowd, shock, disgust, curiosity. Madison's eyes narrowed. "That's out of context." I ignored her and turned to another ribbon. 2 months before my engagement, sat behind Evelyn at board meeting, watched how she spoke to the donors. Practice later at home. If I can mirror her exactly, they'll like me better. A quiet gasp came from somewhere to my left. I knew that voice, one of the donors she'd courted in the past. Madison heard it too, her gaze flicking toward the sound like a boxer scanning for the next blow. I took a step closer. "And then this one," I said, opening to a page where the ink was smudged, the handwriting urgent. "Evelyn doesn't understand old money. She thinks success is built on work. I know it's about image. I can give Alexander the image he needs, with or without her." Madison's breath hitched, just barely, but enough for me to catch. Around us, the crowd had formed a loose semicircle. No one was touching their drinks now. Every eye was on her, and she knew it. "You've spent years," I said, my voice still steady, "building a life out of other people's moments. Practicing their smiles, stealing their words, trying on their futures like dresses in a fitting room. But you've never built anything that's actually yours." Madison's chin lifted in defiance, but her eyes were wet. "You think you're so righteous." "No," I cut in, "I think I'm done." I held up the diaries so the crowd could see the ribbons fluttering in the warm air. "These aren't mine to keep. They're yours. And you can take them back tonight. But understand this, Madison, I'm not giving them to protect you. I'm giving them because I'm finished letting you write yourself into my life." I pressed the stack into her hands. She looked down at them, then back up at me, her expression flickering between anger and something I hadn't seen in her before, fear without calculation. I didn't mean," she began, but her voice cracked. She glanced around the circle of faces, realizing that no one was leaning toward her anymore. No one was buying the act. In fact, many of them looked away, uncomfortable, as if the spectacle was too revealing to witness any longer. Madison clutched the diaries to her chest and stepped back, the gold fabric of her gown catching under her heels. For a moment, I thought she might say something, anything, to claw back the room. But instead, she turned and walked toward the exit, her head bowed slightly. No storming out this time. No grand declaration. Just quiet retreat. The crowd began to murmur again, the tension bleeding away. Victoria approached me first, her eyes sharp with approval. "That," she said softly, "was surgical." Alexander joined us, slipping his arm around my waist. "You've ended it now," he murmured. I watched Madison's figure disappear into the hall beyond. "No," I said. "I've ended it for me. What she does with herself now is her choice." But deep down, I suspected this night would be a fracture point in her life, the moment she realized that the performance had finally run out of audience. After the gala, Madison vanished from Boston like a tide slipping out without warning. No posts. No sightings. No whispers at luncheons about her next move. At first, it was a relief. The absence of her constant shadow felt like sunlight hitting a locked room for the first time in years. But absence has a way of inviting questions, and mine came in the form of a letter. It arrived 3 weeks after the gala, tucked into a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, neat, deliberate, the loops in the Y still too perfect to be casual. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, smelling faintly of the perfume she'd worn at my wedding. "Evelyn," it began, "I've gone somewhere quiet. Somewhere without an audience. I'm not ready to apologize, not yet. But I can't stop thinking about what you said, that I've never built anything of my own. I don't know if I can. But I'm going to try, I read it 3 times, each pass leaving me unsettled. Not because of the words themselves, they were almost mild, but because they lacked the one thing Madison had always wrapped herself in, performance. No flattery. No manipulation. No theatrics. Just a strange, bare honesty. Still, I didn't reply. 2 months later, Charlotte called me. "You won't believe this," she said, her voice low, the way it always was when she had something valuable. "Madison's in France. Small town outside Paris. Working in an art studio. Teaching." I almost laughed. "Teaching what?" "Art therapy," Charlotte said. "Apparently she's good at it." The words didn't fit in my head at first. Madison, who had once catalogued every gesture I made, now guiding other people to express themselves. It felt like hearing that a notorious gossip had taken a vow of silence. I didn't believe it until Victoria confirmed it. She had received a postcard, a watercolor of the French countryside, with a short note, asterisk I'm painting again. Not copies. Originals, asterisk. For weeks, I thought about that. About Madison sitting in some sunlit room, brush in hand, creating something not designed to impress or outshine. About the possibility, however small, that humiliation had cracked something open in her that nothing else had been able to touch. Then, out of nowhere, another envelope arrived. This time, heavier. Inside was a notebook, not leather-bound, not elaborate, just a plain sketchbook. The first page read, asterisk these are my words. My journey. My truth. No imitations, asterisk below it, in smaller script, asterisk you don't have to read it. But I needed to send it, asterisk. The pages that followed were unlike any Madison I'd known. Instead of schemes and observations about my life, there were fragments of conversations she'd had with her students. Reflections on color, on form, on the way a teenager's posture changes when they realize their work matters. Some entries ended abruptly, as if she'd been called away mid-thought. Others were long and rambling, but never about me. Not once. And somewhere between the lines, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry. Madison had been a threat for so long that I'd built part of my identity on countering her. But now, her pages didn't hold my name, my choices, my relationships. They held her own life. And strangely, that felt like a deeper victory than any public exposure. When I told Alexander about the notebook, he studied me for a long moment. You sound relieved, he said. I am, I admitted. It's like she's finally stopped trying to live in my story. He smiled faintly. Or maybe she's finally started writing hers. I didn't send a letter back, not yet. Part of me wanted to see if this change would last beyond the honeymoon phase of self-discovery. But another part, the part that remembered her mascara-streaked face at my wedding, and again at the gala, hoped she would keep going. That she would keep creating something that was hers, without needing me as a reference point. In the quiet that followed, I realized something else. My revenge, the one I had so meticulously planned, had already done its work. Not by destroying her, but by forcing her to see herself clearly. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most permanent damage of all. Because Madison's reckoning had begun. And this time, I wasn't the one pulling the strings. It was almost a year to the day after the gala when I saw her face again, not in person, but in a glossy feature spread in a European lifestyle magazine. I hadn't been looking for her. The issue had been tucked into the stack of reading materials at a boutique hotel in Geneva, where Alexander and I were attending an education summit. The cover teased stories about vineyard escapes and Parisian design trends. And there, on page 34, was a photograph of Madison. She was seated at a wide wooden table, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by children holding paintbrushes. No gowns. No jewels. Just a simple linen shirt spattered with paint and a small smile that looked, for the first time in my memory, unpracticed. The headline read, From Socialite to Soul Work, Madison Clark's Second Life. I must have read the article 3 times before Alexander returned from his morning session. It described how Madison had opened a small art therapy studio in the French countryside, offering workshops to children from disadvantaged backgrounds and survivors of trauma. It wasn't a vanity project. The journalist had visited, spoken to her students, even interviewed the town mayor, who credited her with bringing light to a place that had almost forgotten it. The words didn't sound like the Madison I'd known, but the photographs told the rest of the story. Her posture was different, less guarded, less calculating. Her hands, always so perfectly manicured in the past, were stained with pigment. The students leaned toward her in the pictures, trusting. And in every shot, she seemed to have forgotten about the camera. When Alexander saw it, he gave a low whistle. I'll be damned. She looks real. Or she's learned a whole new kind of performance, I said automatically, but there was no conviction in my voice. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't an act. If Madison had been pretending, she would have worn the right shade of lipstick for the camera, angled her face just so. She hadn't. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived. Heavy cream cardstock, handwritten in her familiar script, * you're invited to the opening of Atelier Clart, Paris, a new center for art therapy and creative education. I'd like you to see what I've built. No tricks. No drama. Just my work. I could have ignored it. Part of me wanted to. But curiosity has a way of pulling you toward old flames, even if they've burned you before. Alexander encouraged me to go. If it's real, he said, maybe you'll finally have the ending you deserve. The atelier was tucked down a cobblestone side street in the Marais district. The front windows were filled with canvases in every imaginable style, abstract bursts of color, delicate portraits, wild landscapes that looked like they'd been painted from the inside out. Inside, the walls were lined with works by her students, each labeled only with a first name and an age. And then she appeared. She looked older, but in a way that suited her. The softness of her face was no longer sculpted by contouring makeup but by something lived in. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping as she moved through the room greeting guests. When she reached me, she paused, as if measuring whether to hug me or keep her distance. Evelyn, she said finally, and the sound of my name was almost cautious. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if I would, I admitted. I know, she said simply. That's why it matters that you did. She guided me through the rooms, showing me sculptures made from recycled materials, collaborative murals that told stories of healing, private studios where survivors of domestic abuse painted in quiet companionship. She spoke with a kind of conviction I'd never heard from her, not about appearances, not about approval, but about purpose. Halfway through the tour, she stopped at a small alcove where a single painting hung, a vivid swirl of crimson, ivory, and gold. The plaque read, "The red dress." My stomach tightened. It's the only piece I've done for myself since I started, she said. It's not about you, or the wedding. It's about what that moment forced me to see, about myself. I studied the painting. The red wasn't flat or theatrical, it was layered, almost wounded. And threaded through it were streaks of white that cut across the canvas like light breaking through storm clouds. It's different, I said finally. So am I, she replied. That evening, as the opening wound down, Madison took the microphone to thank the crowd. And then she surprised me again. I want to acknowledge someone in this room, she said, scanning the guests until her eyes found mine. Someone who once stood in front of me, in a room full of people, and held up a mirror I didn't want to look into. It was humiliating. It was painful. And it saved me. Every head in the room turned toward me. I didn't move. Evelyn, she continued, you didn't just stop me from taking something that wasn't mine. You forced me to find something that was. And this, she gestured to the room, to the students and the art and the life she had built, is the result. The applause was warm, genuine. I stood there, feeling something I couldn't quite name, not forgiveness, not yet, but a loosening. A shift. Afterward, she approached me again, her voice low. You were my sharpest downfall. And my starting point. I nodded slowly. And you were my sharpest lesson. For the first time in years, we smiled at each other without weapons in our hands. If someone had told me years ago that Madison and I would ever share a stage without one of us trying to outshine the other, I would have laughed. Yet 6 months after the Paris opening, that's exactly where I found myself, standing beside her at a press conference, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward us, both of us smiling for the same reason. It started with a phone call I didn't expect. Madison's voice was calmer than I'd ever heard it, but there was an undertone of urgency. "I've been thinking," she said, "about how many people never get the chance to find their own voice until it's too late. Art therapy works for some. But for others, maybe it's technology. What if we combined what we do?" I hesitated. Old habits die hard, and part of me still wondered if this was a setup. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership," she said plainly. "Your educational software, my art programs. We create a platform that gives people the tools to express themselves, through learning, through creating, before they lose their sense of self to comparison and imitation. We teach them how to build from within instead of borrowing from someone else." I didn't answer right away. I could hear Alexander in the background, working in his study, and I thought about what he'd say. Then I thought about the students I'd seen in Paris, their eyes lighting up as they showed their work, and the quiet, steady pride in Madison's voice that night when she spoke about purpose. "Let's talk," I finally said. The following months were a blur of planning. Madison flew to Boston, I visited her in Paris. We sketched ideas over coffee in the morning and wine in the evenings, arguing over details but never over ownership. It was strange. Equal parts unsettling and liberating to realize I didn't need to guard every word, every idea. She wasn't taking any more, she was building alongside me. We named it Written in Light. A hybrid platform and physical program that combined creative expression with digital literacy, teaching participants to tell their stories in ways that were both authentic and empowering. Our target audience was anyone who had ever felt overshadowed, by siblings, by peers, by the invisible expectations they carried. On launch day, the press gathered in the restored Art Hall Madison had converted into a multipurpose space. The walls were lined with both paintings and interactive screens displaying student projects from Boston to Bordeaux. Alexander introduced us, his voice tinged with pride. "This collaboration," he said, "is proof that even the sharpest rivalries can be rewritten." Madison spoke first, sharing how she'd spent years living in someone else's shadow, convinced that success was a zero-sum game. She didn't sugarcoat the ugliness, she even mentioned the red dress, the diaries, the humiliations. "I thought revenge would make me whole," she told the audience. I was wrong. Building something of my own did. And I wouldn't have gotten here without the person I once tried hardest to hurt. When it was my turn, I told the other half. About the years of tension, the traps, the public exposures. How I thought my greatest triumph was making her fall in front of the people she wanted most to impress. But that wasn't the real victory, I said. The real victory is standing here today, knowing that neither of us needs to take from the other to feel complete. The applause was different from the polite clapping of galas or the charged murmurs of scandal. It was warm, sustained, genuine. After the event, as guests mingled, Madison handed me a slim, cloth-bound notebook. "This one's for you," she said. Inside were her notes from our planning process, sketches, quotes, lists. At the back was a short entry in her now familiar handwriting, "I used to write about the life I thought I deserved. Now I write about the one I'm building. Thank you for making me face the page honestly, I traced the words with my fingers, remembering all the pages that had come before, the lies, the schemes, the obsessions. This was different. And it was mine to keep. As the night wound down, we stood side by side, watching participants interact with the new platform for the first time. A teenage boy painted a digital mural that blended into an older woman's poem on the adjoining screen. They didn't know each other, but their work connected seamlessly. Madison leaned toward me and whispered, "It's like they're finishing each other's sentences." I smiled. Or like they've finally stopped competing for the same one. When the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Madison turned to me. "We've come a long way." "Yes," I said, closing the notebook. "And this time, we're walking in the same direction." We locked the doors behind us and stepped out into the Paris night, the streets still wet from an earlier rain. The reflections of the street lamps shimmered like a path ahead, one we'd chosen, together, without needing to take a single step into the other's shadow. 2 years after the launch of Written in Light, I found myself walking through the familiar double doors of the Winchester Foundation's main hall, the same space where Madison had once tried to unmake me with a single scene. Tonight, it wasn't about me. It wasn't about her. It was about what we'd built. The hall was unrecognizable from that night years ago. The chandeliers still glowed, but the walls were alive with color, sound, and movement. One side of the room displayed large-format prints of paintings, sculptures, and digital projects from our students. The other side hummed with interactive screens where visitors could listen to recorded stories, watch animated journals, and explore creative portfolios from participants around the world. In the center of it all, Madison was in her element, but not the old kind. She wasn't holding court. She wasn't posing. She was kneeling beside a 12-year-old boy as he explained the inspiration for his mixed-media piece, her eyes focused entirely on him. No one watching her could doubt that she was exactly where she belonged. Alexander found me near the back, where a video montage played clips from our program's workshops. "You look proud," he said. "I am," I admitted. "And not just of this." We stood together as Madison took the stage to address the crowd. The applause was thunderous, but she didn't bask in it. Instead, she opened with a story, not about art, but about failure. "I used to think success meant looking like I had it all together," she began. "I was wrong. Success is being able to say, 'I lost myself once. And I found my way back.'" Her eyes found mine for the briefest moment, and in that glance, there was no rivalry, no residue of old battles. Only acknowledgement. When it was my turn to speak, I told the audience about our earliest days, not in detail, but enough to make the contrast clear. "If you had seen us back then," I said, "you might never believe we'd be here together tonight." But every page of the story mattered, even the ugly ones. Without them, we wouldn't have known what we were capable of building. Later, after the speeches and the press photos, Madison handed me a gift. It was a shadow box, framed in dark wood. Inside were 2 origami cranes, each folded from pages of our old diaries, hers and mine. One was red, one was white, and they were suspended by nearly invisible threads, their wings angled as if in mid-flight. "I thought you might like to have this," she said. "A reminder that we can make something beautiful out of what once weighed us down." I ran my fingers along the glass. "You've turned the evidence into art." She smiled faintly. We both did. As the evening wound down, the crowd began to thin, and the room settled into a softer hum. Madison stood beside me, watching the last guests leave. "You know," she said quietly, "there was a time when I couldn't imagine an ending where I didn't win and you didn't lose." "And now?" I asked. "Now I see there are endings where we both get to win," she said. "They just look different than I thought." Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of lilacs from the gardens beyond the hall. The street lamps lit our path as Alexander and I walked to the car. Behind us, Madison was still inside, laughing with a group of students as they helped her carry supplies. I looked back once more, and for the first time, there was no part of me braced for her next move. The game we had played for so many years was over, and neither of us had lost. Instead, we had created something larger than our rivalry, something that would outlast us both. And as we drove away, the shadow box resting in my lap, I realized that revenge had been my fuel, but transformation had been the destination. Madison's and mine. Full circle.